Again, thank you for joining us today. My name is Mark Pischea. I'm the President and CEO of the Conservative Energy Network, and we're pleased to hold this webinar today to reveal the results of our annual post-election survey. This is our fifth. We first started in 2016, so which enables us to look at the data over time and assess trends out there. And we're really excited with the level of product that we've been able to develop over time. This year is a little different because we did a pre-election survey, which we have not previously done. The purpose of that was specifically to look at voter attitudes immediately before and then immediately after the election to see if the final weeks or the final narrative of the campaign changed voter attitudes at all, or if messaging reinforced certain attitudes and others. So that's something that Glen is going to talk about when he goes through the numbers. But essentially our purpose here is to assess voter attitudes towards energy policy and politics, and to track that over time to assist us in our work of developing clean energy policy from a conservative perspective, rooted in the ideals of less government, federalism, and free markets. So the data is very interesting from that perspective. And one of the key findings that Glen is going to go through in particular is that there's clear evidence that voters like the aspirational goals that the left have established around clean energy and climate, but that enthusiasm is tempered with a desire to see conservative policies enacted. And so as we go through the numbers here, Glen will lay some of that out, and I'm going to come back on afterwards and talk about that a little bit. Joanna, before I turn it over to Glen, is there any housekeeping that you'd like to announce?
Yes, before Glen gets started, I just want to quickly address how we will handle questions. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button on the right-hand side. Please click there to ask any questions you might have. You can submit questions at any point during the presentation, but Glen and Mark will wait until the end before they start answering them. That's all for me.
All right. Well, thank you, Joanna, and for putting this together. And I'd like to introduce now Glen Bolger, one of the founders and principals of Public Opinion Strategies, one of the nation's top, if not the top, GOP pollsters and researchers. Glen has been doing this research for us since our first survey, and we're thrilled that to be able to continue that relationship and leverage Glen's expertise as we look at the data over time. So with that, I will turn it over to Glen, who is also, by the way, under severe pressure to come up with puns as we go through this. So we'll assess his performance afterwards. So Glen, thanks for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. I can promise you interesting data. I can't promise you puns, they just kind of flow. So hopefully we'll hit some. Mark, before you mute your microphone, can you just confirm for me the presentation is up on the screen?
I see it. Yep, we're good.
Great. I wanted to make sure, because the worst thing is to just start yapping and not have the data for people to see. And one more thing, this is probably more information than people want, but if you're looking at my left eye and you're like, hey, that looks a little kind of like red, like you got punched in the eye, I actually have, of course, since I'm on a Zoom last night, I developed a sty, so I apologize, it's not my best look, but I don't know what my best look is anyhow. So we did the survey December 16th through the 22nd, 1,000 people who voted in the election, and these were all real voters. I know there's some dispute about how many real voters and not there were, but we're going to take voters and the results at their word. It has a credibility interval, which is what we call margin of error for online surveys, of plus or minus 3.53% on this survey. Quickly on the political environment, voters have become more pessimistic about the direction of the country since the election. Here's what's interesting. What you're going to see happen is when President Biden gets inaugurated next Wednesday, Democrats will become much more optimistic about the direction of the country. Right now, the reason that both are pessimistic, I mean, the numbers are more pessimistic, is because both Republicans and Democrats are pessimistic, because Republicans know that they lost. Well, most of them, a lot of them do, but they also know that Trump won't be president. And Democrats are like, well, Trump's still president. And remember, this was before the events last Wednesday. Survey was done in mid-December. As you can see, Republicans now are 59% wrong track. They haven't been there since just after the 2016 election. Independents are very pessimistic, and Democrats not quite as pessimistic, but still 80% wrong track. You watch the first national surveys you see, and this is of political interest, so that's why I'm sharing it with you, even if it's not about clean energy. The first national surveys that you see after the inauguration, Democrat numbers will have risen dramatically. They'll be up about where Republican numbers were during the Trump administration. We had 50% say they voted for the Democratic candidate for Congress from their district. 45% voted Republican, which, by the way, let me go back to this. You'll note was a lot closer than where people were in early October. But as we saw in other data, late deciders voted overwhelmingly for President Trump and also for Republicans running for Congress. So a pretty good surge there, and Republicans, as you know, picked up seats in November. I'm going to skip over some of this and get, well, first on the presidential ballot test, the overall final results, 51.4 to 46.9. Our data showed it 51 to 46 as well. We saw it on all of the post-election surveys, the exit polling, that you see the independent numbers, that Biden won them by 15 points. And you'll hear me talk a lot about independent voters on this survey. Look at the partisans. 93% of Republicans voted for President Trump. 93% of Democrats voted for President-elect Biden. So it was very partisanly polarized. That's not surprising these days. And the main reason that Trump lost was that he did not do anywhere as well as he did in 2016 among independent voters. Going to issues now overall. Well, I'm going to skip over this part just in the interest of time. Let's go to the domestic energy production. And that is, we ask, do you think that as a country, the United States should put more emphasis, less emphasis, or about the same emphasis as it does now on producing domestic energy from each of the following sources? These aren't the only three. There'll be a couple more pages of data as well, but it's interesting to show the trend. Wind has dropped, but it's still very positive, 55 to 18, more emphasis compared to less emphasis. And what you want to think about is what's the ratio on these? And for wind, it's about 3 to 1. For solar, it's better than 4 to 1, 64 to 13. Not quite as strong as what we saw earlier in our surveys, previous years where it was in the mid 70s, but still 64% is the high, no pun intended, given hydropower is next, but the high water mark. There you go, Mark, there's one pun. Hydropower, 57.10, that's 5.7 to 1. It's pretty easy when the denominator is 10 to figure out what the ratio is. So, again, hydropower has a very positive image ratio as well, 57, more emphasis, 10, less emphasis. Less positive, coal, better than 2 to 1 negative, 20% more emphasis, 47% less emphasis. It's the first time in our surveys that coal has been below 50% less emphasis. But again, we're talking about better than 2 to 1 negative. Natural gas, back to is a positive. It's actually the highest, more emphasis number that we've seen at 46%, with pretty consistent number there at 18%. It's been as high as 23, but it's mostly in that kind of 18% range. Nuclear power evenly divided, 33% more emphasis, 34% less emphasis. I know that there are advocates, a lot of advocates of clean energy who are like, goodness gracious, I mean, nuclear power, it's clean energy, it's efficient, but there's just the stigma attached. Hopefully, we don't see as many people have a meltdown over it. Okay, that one was kind of forced. But anyhow, there you go. And then on biomass and clean coal, those are two that we added in the 2018 survey. You can see biomass still, look, 26 more emphasis, 21 less emphasis. It's tighter than it's been, but it's also a sign, I think, that a lot of people don't know what it is. I mean, basically 53%, the number, if you subtract 26 and 21 from 100, you get 53%. That's the percent roughly who say about the same emphasis, just because people don't know a lot about it. Clean coal image is improving. It's up to 40% more emphasis, 28% less emphasis, but it's not even close to 1.5 to 1 in terms of positive to negative perception of it. This shows it among Republicans. Natural gas at 55% is the strongest, only 8% say less emphasis. Coal, which is negatively perceived overall, is 1 to 1. Again, that's not necessary. That's not like a real positive sign for coal, when the partisan group that backs it the most is still only 1 to 1. Wind, as we know, has taken its lumps recently, ever since the president has started attacking wind. It'll be interesting to see with him out of office. Obviously, he's got not quite allowed a megaphone, if those numbers improve, or if his hot air on this continues to have an impact. Yep, there's pun number 3. I'm almost there to number 4. Then after that, I can relax. Solar power among Republicans, lowest, more emphasis, but still 2 to 1 over less emphasis, better than 2 to 1, 45 to 21. Nuclear power does get good marks from Republicans, 40 to 23, and then hydropower also cleans up at 47-11. Among independents, you can see coal not nearly as negative as it has been, but it's still more than 3 to 1 seen as less emphasis compared to more emphasis. Natural gas also hit a new high among among independents at 48%. Wind's down a bit, but still almost 4 to 1, 56-15. Solar power doesn't shine as bright, but it's still good at 61 to 10, 6.1 to 1. Nuclear power a slightly net negative. And I know what you're thinking to yourself, okay, how is nuclear power 1 to 1 if it's positive among Republicans and only a small net negative among independents? That's because Democrats are not fond. They're pretty negative towards nuclear power. And then hydropower, about the same with Republicans, which I'm showing right now, and then back to the independents at 52-11. Republicans are 47-11. So pretty close there. On party issue handling, who do you trust to do a better job? Democrats, not shockingly, have advantages on these issues. The environment, their Republicans trail by 19. Energy issues by 8. Clean energy issues by 15. And by the way, we split sample those two. So survey respondents either see energy issues or clean energy. It's not like they're saying, oh, I'm favorable to one, but not the other. It's totally split. And then climate change, Democrats have a 20-point advantage. This is a relatively new series. We don't have a ton of historical data on this set of questions. Turning now to clean energy. Would you say you support or oppose the government taking action to accelerate the development and use of clean energy in the United States? These numbers remain solid, very strong overall. Intensity's down a bit. I'll talk about that in a second. But look at the overall data. That's the top line. The dark blue, total support, 84%. It has, as the stockbrokers say, it's got a relatively thin trading range. The low is 80, the high is 89%. And right now it's right in the middle of that. The total opposed is the 16% long. I'm not even sure. I guess that's a dark red as opposed to a more pinkish on the strongly opposed. Again, that's not, you look at the ratio of 84 to 16, and that's obviously pretty significant, better than 5 to 1. Intensity is down. You're at 44% strongly support compared to, of course, very low number of only 5% who strongly oppose. My thought on this is, and I don't know this for a fact, but it could be a sign, excuse me, first of all, it's not coronavirus, my cough, and secondly, if it is, you can't get it from a Zoom call. But the 44% may be down just because of, by the way, the pandemic, because we saw in October it was at 50%, which was also the low, where people are saying, like, yeah, let's get back, I'm for this, but before we put a lot of oomph behind it, let's get back to a more normal set of circumstances in terms of both the economy and obviously our health. And you look at it by party. Look, when you've got 72% of Republicans, 86% of independents, and 95% of Democrats supporting it, that's bipartisan. Yes, Republicans not quite as supportive, but that's still approximately 3 to 1. And of course, independents 86, Democrats 95. So very significant there. And look, as we saw from the ballot test, independents decide who wins elections in this country. I know everybody says, oh, what about the base? What about? Yes, it's important to have a unified base. But oftentimes what happens is Democrats unify the Republican base, Republicans unify the Democratic base, and so the battle is over independence. And when you're losing by 15, that's why you end up losing a national election. When you look at Republicans who won, whether it be for Senate or for House, they did much better among independents or for governor. Not as many gubernatorial elections, obviously. You look at it by age. Look, Republicans have huge challenges among younger voters, and that's one of the reasons that we don't do well with it. And that's one of the reasons that clean energy, I think, is such a good issue for Republicans to run. So who's attracted to it? Well, who have we seen so far? Independents and younger voters, both, groups that Republicans need to do well with. We're not necessarily going to turn things around immediately with younger voters, but coming out pro clean energy and having a good message on it and putting some resources into that message can help a Republican candidate do better than the typical Republican does with those younger voters. And by the way, it's not like older voters are saying, harumph, we don't need this. They're at 80% seniors who support government action on clean energy. And keep in mind, we didn't ask specific, okay, what kind of action? Well, this is a question that gets into that. Would you prefer approaches like competition, markets, businesses? 63%. Government mandates, subsidies, and quotas, 20%. A price or tax put on carbon emissions, down at 17%. Look at what the Republican, the conservative approach is, and that's the one at the top. 63% resonates. And that goes back to Mark's point earlier that I'll summarize quickly, and we'll touch on this a number of times because it's important. Yes, voters support more liberal ideals on clean energy, but they support conservative policies to get there. And I think that's very important and gives Republican candidates who run on this, who include this as part of their messaging, a lot of credibility. And look at it by party. Competition, 63% overall, but among Republicans, 79% pick competition. And then what's that other group I talk about? Independent, 71%. Democrats, they're at 45%. So if you add up the other two, which are more government driven, that adds up to 54%. Now, again, 45% of Democrats, you're not going to get 45% of the Democratic vote by talking about it. But if it splits a little bit off, that's very helpful too. But again, I like that 71%. The most important number on there, sorry, let me say it a different way. The most important number on there is that 71% among independents. We also find that a majority of voters, 72%, say it's important that a candidate for political office shares their opinion on clean energy. I think that's down this time because I think it was less of a topic in the election. Obviously, it was dominated by a number of different things, candidate personalities, and obviously coronavirus and the economy. Now, again, 72% still relatively significant, although the percentage who say very important dropped to 29%. The percentage who say not important is 28%. Again, it is when you've got 72% of voters saying, yeah, that's important. And you see it even among Republicans, the slim majority, 51% say that it's important. Well, you know, reaching those voters plus, again, the 75% of independents who say it's important. Reaching those voters is important. It's not like a Republican, if you talk about the issue, is going to say, you know, if you care about that issue as, you know, as much as or nearly as much as the Democratic candidate, I'm not going to vote for you. They'll just look at everything else. Independence, it is definitely something that can attract independents to support a conservative, you know, or a Republican, depending on how you want to call it. Clean energy developments like solar and wind, 68% would vote for an elected official or candidate who supports that. 13% say they would vote against. The intensity, 32%. Again, we've seen relatively stable numbers there. It's not as high as what we saw in the past, but again, I think that there's a good likelihood that we'll see those numbers pop back up in the 2022 election cycle. Republicans, not as strong, 45%. But look, Republicans are supportive, but independents, they're the ones we care about, and they're 6-1. And again, I care about Republicans, don't want to imply that we don't, but again, they're for it, just not nearly as strongly as independents. How likely are you to consider purchasing an electric vehicle when you make your next vehicle purchase? Interesting, 45% say likely, 15% very likely. And you say, well, that's a relatively small number, the percent very likely. It's basically what we saw in pre-election too, when it was 17%. Well, I guarantee you that the electric car manufacturers would love to see 15% of the car buying public purchase an electric vehicle. So that's a sign that, you know, it's there and it's just going to grow. Who's most likely to consider? These are the groups most likely to say they're very likely to consider purchasing an electric vehicle. Younger men, liberals, Democratic men, minority men, younger voters overall, younger Democrats, Democrats with college degrees, base Democrats, white Democrats. It's a lot of the voters that you would expect, not surprisingly, younger and more liberal / Democratic. On page 34, well, I'm showing it, so I don't have to tell you the page. Agree, disagree. Nuclear energy should be included and prioritized as part of the country's clean energy mix. 66% agree with it. Only 34% disagree with that. Intensity's on the low side, 23%. And that's a sign that people are like, yeah, okay, that sounds good, but they're not convinced, which suggests that advocates of clean energy who support nuclear energy need to continue to make a case, continue to educate, that it is a good clean energy source of energy, or a good clean source of energy. And what's interesting is you look at it by party, and Republicans are the most likely to support it. 71% now, 76 back in October. It's not a big fluctuation, obviously. Independents, a majority as well. Even Democrats, you've got 62% who say it. So they're not, even though they're a little dubious about nuclear power, they are not unwilling to embrace it as an option out there. Turning now to some questions on climate change. How important was the issue to your vote? People before the election said it was very important at 38%, after the election at 24%. Total 72% said it was important before the election, 55% after. So it's an interesting difference, but it's still a majority. You look at it by party. Republicans before the election, 55%, yeah, that's important. 28% after the election, 48% of independents, down 20 points. Only Democrats didn't move that much. Now, again, that's not to say when you look at the independents, half of them say it is important to their vote. You look at it by age, there was drop off across all age groups, but not shockingly, it's highest among 18 to really 44-year-olds. Because there's really no difference between 18 to 34 and 35 to 44 in terms of how much importance they ascribe to this issue in terms of their vote. We do have 78% who favor the government taking steps to reduce emissions of gases like carbon dioxide and methane emissions that cause global climate change. Intensity's down a bit, but again, I think that may go back to just how much oxygen coronavirus or COVID was sucking out of the room. You look at it by party, and you can see Republicans, 59%. Not as high as the pre-election survey, but still much higher than what we saw in our 2018 and 2019 surveys. Independents have been steady as a rock. Last three surveys in particular, 76, 82, and 80. And boy, Democrats, no question how supportive or that they favor this by a very significant number, steady number as well. And again, by generation, we talk about younger voters. They're the ones that Republicans had a challenge with, did not do very well with. This is something that they favor by a huge number. Over 6 to 1, almost 7 to 1. Then we gave them 4 options in terms of the impact of climate change on society. It's an extreme threat, 39%. This is a new question, by the way, that we first tested back in October. 29% say it's a threat to be considered. 21% is a minor threat, and 12% it's not at all a threat. So again, you have 68% saying that it is some level of a threat, and only 33% is rounding, so saying that it's not a minor or not a threat. Then we asked, okay, assuming that climate change is caused by humans, what's the best way to deal with the issue? Research, development, and innovation of clean energy sources, improving market structure and incentives to allow clean energy technologies to more fairly compete. Those combined, 23 and 22, 45% of where people are at. Then you have 11% on more increased regulations, 10% on getting rid of fossil fuels, phasing them out, and then 7% international agreements. And 7% say, hey, all of the above. And that goes back, the top two at 45% combined, go back to Mark's point about it's the conservative policies that people are looking to pave the way on these issues, whether it's clean energy or climate change. Do you approve or disapprove of the job the Republican Party is doing addressing climate change? Relatively similar between October and December. Right now, or in the December survey, 45% approve, 55% disapprove. Obviously, intensity is higher among the strong disapproval at 36, 23% strongly approve. You break it by party, Republicans approve, independents do not. They're 35% approve, 65% disapprove, and then Democrats, Democrats obviously strongly disapprove, but that's not a surprise. More likely or less likely to support a Republican candidate who embraces an innovation-based approach to addressing climate change. 68% more likely. Intensity is a bit soft at 19%, much more likely. You say, well, Glenn, you always talk about how important intensity is in public opinion. Well, look, the reason it's soft is we haven't filled any of the details. You know, and that's where you go back to some of the policy stuff that we've already talked about, and we're going to get to some more that work really well, that test really well, and that's how you fill in the blank and say, okay, here's what innovation-based approach means. And you know, when you do that, and because right now it's sort of amorphous, which is why the much more likely is a bit on the low side. And by the way, you know, except in really rock rib Republican districts, you can get 68% saying more likely, but that doesn't mean you'll get 68%. So some people will drop off. But look at who's more likely. Well, it's a lot of groups that we always have challenges, often have challenges. Moderate liberal Republicans, they're not the biggest part of the party, but in a general election, they can make a difference between winning and losing. Younger Republicans, younger women, Republican women, younger independents, younger voters overall, white moderate voters, soft lean Republicans. So a whole lot of different swing voters who, you know, we kind of start to care about the closer we get to an election. So this just underscores that it does help with the swing voters. Then we asked whether you'd be more favorable, your view of congressional Republicans would be more favorable or less favorable if they embraced a conservative approach to addressing clean energy, prioritizing technology, innovation, and competition. And again, 75% more favorable. Now, intensity is a bit soft at 20%, but that's where you got to fill in the details. You know, this kind of approach, I like to say you got to lead voters to water and make them drink it. This kind of approach leads voters to the water, and then the details, the policy ID specifics, that's the things that get them to drink the water. It's not a pun, but it's a pretty good analogy. And look, by party, yeah, you get a majority of Democrats saying it, doesn't mean that'll happen. But look at independents, 78% more favorable. And of course, Republicans, you know, you got 15% saying less favorable, but that's where the other Republican staples come in, such as, you know, fighting higher taxes and improving, you know, cutting regulations and fighting socialism. So those messages, you know, if you're worried about that 15%, those messages remind Republicans who are maybe concerned, again, 15% is not a huge number, but who may be a little bit concerned that, oh yeah, there are differences between the Republican and Democrat that I do feel very comfortable about. And then you see voters, regardless of age or gender, would view congressional Republicans more favorably this way as well. More likely or less likely to support a candidate for public office who believes human activity is contributing to climate change, 72% more likely, 28% less likely. And again, you see the intensity, much more likely 31, much less 11, so it's nearly 3 to 1. Republicans are evenly divided, independents 70-30 essentially, and of course Democrats are always strong on this issue. On the electric grid, given America's unpreparedness for the coronavirus pandemic, obviously October was the first time we asked this question because that was our first poll since the pandemic started, and I guarantee you that Mark and his team were not, nor me, nor I, were smart enough to say, you know what, I think there's going to be a pandemic in the future. So we should include pandemic in this question. Anyhow, how important is it to you that we apply lessons learned, take steps, begin taking steps to protect our electricity grid from disaster? 58% very important, 33% somewhat important, 91% obviously important overall. This is one of those things that's not something people think about, unless there's a major problem. And, by that point in time, it's often too late. So these voters are saying, oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, that's pretty important. We need to do something. Now, most of the people who are likely to say that it's very important tend to be Democrats, but a lot of them are, like you see conservative Democrats up there, and other groups. And by the way, when you have 58% saying very important, that means even the lower numbers, like Republicans, that's still in the 40s, which is a pretty significant number on very important. Some policy proposals that we tested, they all tested extremely well. Good rule of thumb on policy proposals is you look at the strong intensity. Anything over 30% that is either strongly favored or strongly opposed is either a pretty good idea to voters or a pretty bad idea. These are all in low 40s, high 30s. So it does pretty well. The baseball analogy I use is that anything in the 30s is a single, anything in the 40s is a double, unless it's the high 40s, then it's a triple. 50s is a homer, 60s is a grand slam. So we got, we could string together a bunch of base hits here. I'm not going to read each of these, but I do know, and Mark will mention this as well after we're done, that this presentation is going to be up on their website. Then we tested 4 more policy ideas. The weakest, as you can see, carbon capture and storage. And again, that's because this may shock everybody on this Zoom call, but people on their own Zoom calls are not saying, boy, something we really need is carbon capture and storage. And that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of noting, look, this is not something people are that familiar with by any stretch. So, and look at how long the question is. So when you have to add that much explanation, intensity is going to be a bit on the lower side. And then we asked a different set of proposals to help expand clean energy in the US. Again, these tested pretty well. Taxing, the one at the bottom, a carbon tax. There's majority support. Intensity is a bit soft, but guess what? It's a tax. We're talking about a new tax. People always get kind of shaky about that, a little bit on the nervous side. And that's the thing. Look, if you or your organization supports that, you're going to have to work hard to sell that to the public, to change people's minds. We also asked on 2 issues in terms of property owners and clean energy. How important are each of these policies to help expand a state's commitment to clean energy, protecting property owners' ability to produce energy on their land, and also protecting their rights to lease their land for renewable energy production? You see it tests off the charts. And just so there's no confusion, when you're hitting 90 and 87%, saying it's total important, even Republicans are in the mid 80s on that. Turning now to message testing. This is what we call combat message development, where we give both sides what both sides say, and we try to be as fair as possible. And as you can see, this is on owners of electric vehicles, whether they should be subject to special taxes or not, because they're not paying gas taxes, or certainly lower gas taxes, and those taxes subsidize the cost of charging stations. So when you make the case that there should be a tax, 50% say yeah. When you say there should not be a tax, they there should be credited because they're doing a lot of good for the country and for the environment, 50% agree with that. So you can see Americans are pretty divided on that one. On net metering, It is seen as fair by 55-45. Again, that's relatively close, but you're moving into the majority territory on that one. I'll leave it up for a second in case people want to look at the wording. Again, this will be up on the CEN website. Rural renewable wind and solar projects, are they good or are they bad? And we gave a quick summation, both the pros and the cons, and people come down on the pro side, 74-26. Then we asked we split sampled 2 questions about a new electricity system. And as you can see, people are saying, yeah, we need new, we need more choice. Choice is always a positive, strong word. And as you can see here, it's pretty overwhelming compared to the current electricity system. And then nearly finally, we asked a series of 5 agree-disagree statements about accelerating the growth of clean energy by speeding up the development. And here's some different messages that were tested. And as you can see, they all tested very strongly. Now, look, for a lot of people, this is the first time they thought about this. That's why, the strong agreement's not higher, I believe, because it's like, okay, I'm just kind of processing this for the first time. But as you can see, overall, it's, support is pretty dominant. Agreement, is anywhere from 75% to 86%. Now that you've heard more about support or oppose government taking action, support drops a few points. It's basically margin of error stuff, 80-20. The big picture is it's still overwhelmingly, obviously 4-1 in this case in support as opposed to opposition. So with that, I'm going to not mute myself, but turn it back over to Mark Pischea so he can lead the Q&A, handle the Q&A and lead any discussion on this.
Thank you, Glenn. A lot of data there. And as you could see in the front part of Glenn's presentation, we skipped over a few slides just for the sake of time. But those slides, as well as all the ones Glenn ran through, as he mentioned, will be available on our website, conservativeenergynetwork.org/polling. If we can send that link directly to all the participants, we will. But conservativeenergynetwork.org/polling. I do want to just reinforce a few of the things that Glenn mentioned, back to the initial statement that I made about voters wanting more aspirational, they like the aspirational goals that the left has set around climate and clean energy, but they really want Republican policy solutions, looking at things like how we not grow the government, how we not do this with mandates and subsidies, how we're not picking winners and losers, and not signing unilaterally onto foreign agreements. But they want competition, they want more private sector involvement, and they want Republicans at the table. I think when those things happen, we're going to see support, particularly on the right, increase dramatically. So we do have some questions that I want to get to. The first one is, for Glenn, one can see the benefit for Republican candidates in talking about clean energy in a general election, but seems like it's still difficult territory in primaries, on the Republican primaries. What are your thoughts, Glenn?
Well, I think there's something to that. I mean, it's clearly not as important to Republican primary voters as it is to kind of more swing Republicans and certainly independents. It's a bit of I think a tougher sell, but I mean, basically, look, you got to win the primary first. You go out and do that by focusing on primary voter issues, except of course crazy conspiracy theories like the election was stolen, and then you go on and broaden your appeal in the general election. And a lot of Republicans were able to do that this year, on the state level and on the federal level, and again, we see it's a good magnet for attracting independent voters.
Great, thank you. Well, and I think also, just to add to that, the more conservatives get on board with engaging on clean energy, the less divisive that will be.
I think that's
going
right.
forward.
Yeah, especially when they see that it's becoming much more of a factor in our economy. I think that there are Republican or conservative voters who look at clean energy and think it's still a microcosm of our economy, and I don't think they realize quite how much it's grown over the last, I don't know, 10 years or whatever the right data point is, starting point is, to now.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you for the question. How much of the Republican results versus Democrat could be attributed to a lack of education or education differential? Could more conservative education on clean energy help? I think we just heard part of that response, but Glenn, any other thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the more you destigmatize an issue among voters who don't like it, the easier it is for them to kind of understand, the truth of it. And I think that, there have been efforts among some conservatives to attack it. And, people hear that and say, oh, okay, that's pretty bad. But when, you kind of walk through, no, this is what, that was then, that was Solyndra, that was Barack Obama's administration. When you look at where things are now, and how much it's grown as part of our economy, and how much more efficient it is, how much less expensive it is, people, that'll change people's minds. I mean, as Ronald Reagan said, facts are stubborn things.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, next question. And we've got a lot of them. Thank you. These are very good questions. Do you think the drop in support on addressing climate change between before and after surveys, for and after election surveys, is a matter of prioritization, perhaps COVID vaccine distribution is more important, or comfort that a Biden administration will address climate change, therefore voters are prioritizing something else?
Well, that's a good question. And my response to that, or my theory would be, the answer is yes. In other words, it's a number of different things. Sometimes in politics, there's one thing, and other times it's more than one thing. And I think that, you've got prioritization as an issue. And secondly, yeah, it might be, look, Biden's in, the administration, they clearly, obviously, will be more supportive as opposed to more hostile than elements of the Trump administration. And by the way, to be fair to the Trump administration, there were elements of the Trump administration and policy making that were supportive of clean energy. So, but yeah, I think that people look at that and say, well, I mean, look at the question on, here we go, partisan trust. Who do they trust more? A significant number tend to trust the Democrats. So I think that's a factor as well. But right now, especially with the surge, I think that coronavirus, the vaccine, and concerns about COVID do have an impact as well.
Yeah, and I would add to that, we saw, in our October survey, a dip across the board on conservative support for clean energy, renewables. And I think that is more the former than the latter. I think we're seeing in particular, not just the impact of COVID, but the impact that COVID has had on the economy and how that has shaped people's views. So good question. Next one, I think to what degree, if any, do you think the extraordinary events following the election may have impacted survey responses? Obviously we went into the field mid-December, so anything that happened after that wouldn't be factored, but we certainly were going through a time then when the election results were disputed. What are your thoughts on that, Glenn?
Yeah, look, it certainly could have an impact. Even though you would think of that as like totally unrelated to each other, like, clean energy's over here, election fair, was it fair, would be over here, doesn't mean it doesn't have some sort of impact. And to what degree, I can't calculate. But yes, I think it probably does have some modest impact.
Yeah, and then that actually goes to our last question here. So if anybody has any more, please submit them now. But any theories on what might be driving the overall drop in support for an emphasis on renewables, wind and solar in particular? Is renewable energy becoming more polarized like climate?
Yeah, yes, I think that has something to do with it. Some of it, if I've pulled that slide up, as you can see it, what's of note to me is the drop in more emphasis has been more significant than the increase in less emphasis. So it's almost like voters are saying, yeah, I don't know if we need more. They don't want less though. So we're ramping up. And the third option, which we don't show on here just to keep the chart a little bit cleaner, is the percent who say same emphasis. But based on the way we asked the question, you can pretty much count on it. For example, wind, let's go back to wind in November of 2016, 70 more emphasis, 13 less emphasis. That adds up to 83. That means 17% said about the same emphasis. Now you've got 55-18 instead of 83. That adds up to 73. Actually, I can do math. But that means 27% are saying the same. So it's not so much an increase in the less emphasis as it is a decrease in the more emphasis. And I think part of that is, I don't know that as much advance as there been on clean energy like wind and solar power, I don't know that Americans kind of realize the full story on that. So I think that's an indication to the industries that they need to do more to tell that story, so people realize, oh, we're making pretty significant improvements. When I travel to a country like Spain, which has a lot of wind, they will tell you, oh, here's how much, and I don't remember the percentage, it was a couple of years ago, but here's how much we're getting from wind. You ask an American today, I would bet that 99% of them have no idea how much energy, what percent of our energy comes from clean energy now. I know it's more than it was, 4, 6, 8, 10 years ago. But again, I think people would be surprised to find out actually how much is.
Yeah, particularly in the heartland. So a couple late questions came in, Glenn, that I want to get to. To view Democratic aspirational goals and Republican policies to achieve these goals as purely political alignments is oversimplifying. People want clean air, clean water, and the politics are getting in the way. I don't think we would disagree with that, that this is a hyper-politicized issue. And part of the work that we're doing is to bring that down considerably so that we can have a real discussion on policies and get to the heart of the matter. Glenn, any thoughts on that?
I think in terms of the question, the person asking the question makes an excellent point. I think they also should recognize that I think, and I hate to be speaking for you, Mark, but I think that you view what CN is doing is trying to convince conservatives that, hey, there's a lot of ground to be made, political positives, by talking about conservative policies to help advance clean energy, that it's not something that you shouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole.
Right. A couple quick hits here. Have you polled on the issue of whether the federal government or state government should support clean energy policies?
We've done both, and the data is not that different. There's generally, pretty significant support for government taking action. I just pulled up this slide, which is a question that we ask whether we're doing a statewide survey, and we ask about state government or this national survey, and it doesn't say federal government or national government, but at the same time, because we say United States, it's implied. But again, we haven't seen a ton of difference on this.
Yeah, well, we did ask, as part of our messaging, a question about the importance of developing clean energy at the state level to enhance state competitiveness, and that continues to score really strong. When we talk about local development, that continues to score really strong. I think we're seeing, no evidence to the contrary that voters still prefer solutions at a more local level than a national level. And especially these days, there's some reticence about the federal government coming in and with a heavy hand, especially on issues like this. So next question, Glenn, are there any external factors that make Republican voters more supportive of wind and solar power? Things like, or less, things like natural disasters, economic downturns, COVID, et cetera. Are those external factors that should be considered?
Well, we haven't really polled on that, so I don't know the answer. I do think that when you look, for example, at wind, it's had its ups and downs. As you can see, this is among Republicans, the chart I put up, I just went to. And I think that President Trump has any number of times spoken out against wind power. I'm not quite sure why, but I think that's had an impact.
Okay. Final question.
Yeah, I don't know. Sorry.
For real, final question. I think of a carbon dividend as a way of stimulating clean energy development without growing government. If you would ask people about support for a carbon dividend, my guess is you'll get a more positive response on asking about a price on carbon, even though a dividend would be attached to a price on carbon. Can you speak to that?
Yes, a number of years ago, I did a survey specifically testing the carbon dividend or clean energy, carbon dividend, clean energy dividend. And people reacted much more positively to that. I agree with that perspective. And I've also seen it, not a poll that I did, but somebody else here with the firm did on carbon dividend not long ago, and it showed relatively similar results. So yeah, the framing can be important. The challenge with it is that you have to spend a lot of time explaining what it is, because, and kind of, it's not a one question. It's not a one question or series of questions. It's a series of questions.
Thank you, Glenn. One of the things that we've done with our research, recently, is we did a number of oversamples in states prior to the election. And we did an oversampling after the election as well in Wisconsin. So we have pre-election state results and post-election state results in Wisconsin that we'll be revealing as a case study during a webinar next week on the 21st. So I would encourage everybody who is interested in a deeper dive into some of these state-based solutions to join us for that. Whether you have an interest in Wisconsin or any other state, I think the results are informative. With that, I want to thank Glenn and Gabe at POS for another great project for us. I want to thank all of you for taking time to join and hanging in through the full hour. If I've been notified by Joanna and Tom that the polling data in Glenn's slideshow are up on our website, and I believe Joanna has sent the link out to everybody who's participated on this call. So feel free to go visit and dive deeper. And Glenn, unless you've got any final thoughts, I think I got the fun count around 7 or 8. So the over definitely wins.
Right. Oh, good. I am out of puns, so it's probably time to wrap up.
So thank you all. Have a good rest of the day, and we look forward to talking to you soon.